The horses arrived first, nearly 200 of them tethered in a loose ring 300 yards from the cabin. Their breath made ghosts in the October cold, while riders checked pistols and torches under a waning moon. Behind them came the wagons, then men on foot carrying axes and rope, until the circle tightened like a noose around a structure that measured barely 20 feet square. By midnight on October 14, 1872, nearly 1,000 Klansmen surrounded a lone cabin in the hills outside Pulaski, Tennessee, convinced they were about to capture stolen Union gold and hang a coward who had run from battle. What they didn't know was that the man inside had spent 6 years preparing for this exact night. Isaiah Cole had fought in a different kind of war, one where bodies vanished and no one heard the killing. The Klan believed numbers guaranteed victory. Isaiah understood that numbers could also guarantee chaos. Isaiah Cole arrived in Giles County in the spring of 1866 with a wagon, 2 mules, and a reputation that followed him like smoke. People said he deserted from the 14th United States Colored Troops during the siege of Petersburg, that he'd thrown down his rifle and run when the Confederate works exploded, leaving his company to fight without him. The story spread through the freedmen settlements around Pulaski before Isaiah ever spoke a word, carried by veterans who claimed to remember him, though none could say exactly when or where the desertion happened. The truth was more complicated, but Isaiah never corrected anyone. He bought 40 acres of hill land 7 miles southwest of town, acreage no one else wanted because the soil was thin and the grade too steep for proper farming. He paid cash, which raised eyebrows, and filed the deed with a white lawyer named Harlan Bosch, who handled land transactions for black buyers without charging extra for the risk. The cabin Isaiah built sat at the end of a long valley, accessible by a single wagon track that wound through oak and hickory thick enough to hide a regiment. He kept to himself. Twice a month he came to town for supplies, purchased what he needed with minimal conversation, and disappeared back into the hills. He never attended the Freedmen's Church, never joined the labor meetings, never spoke about the war. When other black farmers gathered to discuss protection against night riders, Isaiah stayed home. When the Klan burned crosses on nearby properties, he didn't attend the community response. Some called him sensible for avoiding trouble. Others called him something worse. His younger brother Samuel thought differently. Samuel had been 9 when Isaiah left for the war and 15 when Isaiah returned. He'd grown tall and angry in the years between, shaped by stories of Confederate atrocities and post-war violence that never seemed to end. In 1868, Samuel moved from their mother's house in Nashville to live with Isaiah, drawn by the idea that isolation meant safety. The brothers worked the land together for 4 years, Samuel handling most of the planting, while Isaiah spent long hours in the cabin or walking the surrounding woods with no apparent purpose. Samuel married in 1871, a woman named Ruth from one of the church families. They moved into a small house near the freedmen settlement, close enough to the black community that Ruth wouldn't feel so alone. Isaiah attended the wedding, but left before the dancing started. The last time Samuel saw his brother was in August of 1872, when Isaiah came to town for flour and salt. They spoke for perhaps 5 minutes outside the general store. Samuel asked if Isaiah would come to church, just once, to meet some of the young families building new lives despite the terror. Isaiah said he'd think about it, but both men knew he wouldn't. The distance between them had nothing to do with affection. Isaiah loved his brother the way a man loves something too precious to keep close when wolves are circling. Samuel understood this only in retrospect, after it was far too late. The attack on Ezekiel Chapel happened on September 7, 1872, under a sky so clear you could count stars. 17 Klansmen rode into the freedmen's settlement just after midnight, their faces hidden behind white hoods, their horses draped in red cloth. They surrounded the small church while families slept in cabins nearby, then set fire to all four corners simultaneously using hay soaked in kerosene. The building was wooden, dry from a summer drought, and it caught like tinder. Samuel Cole was staying in a cabin 50 yards from the church that night, helping a friend repair a roof damaged in a storm. He heard the horses first, then shouting, then the crack of timber as the church's roof collapsed inward. By the time he reached the dirt road, flames were licking 30 feet into the air, and the Klansmen were moving toward the residential cabins. Samuel ran back, woke his friend's family, and helped them escape into the woods. Then he made the mistake of returning for a quilt his friend's mother had sewn, a thing that held no monetary value but represented 10 years of careful work. They caught him coming out of the cabin, 3 Klansmen on horseback, moving fast enough that Samuel had no chance to run. They didn't ask questions. One man roped Samuel's wrists while another fashioned a noose, and the third rode to the nearest oak with a branch strong enough to hold a man's weight. The entire sequence took less than 4 minutes. When Ruth Cole came looking for her husband at dawn, she found him hanging 10 feet off the ground, the quilt he'd tried to save, lying in the dirt beneath his boots. Sheriff William Deckard investigated the following day. He took statements from 6 witnesses who'd seen the Klansmen, but could identify none of them because of the hoods. He noted the burned church, the lynched man, and the general atmosphere of terror, then filed a report that concluded insufficient evidence existed to pursue charges. No arrests were made. No one was questioned under oath. The county newspaper ran a brief item on page 4 noting that a Negro man had died during a fire of suspicious origin. Isaiah heard about his brother's death on September 9th, when a freedman named Thomas Garrett rode out to the cabin with the news. Thomas was 60, too old to work full days, but still trusted to carry messages between the scattered black families. He'd known Isaiah slightly during the war, enough to recognize that the man's silence didn't mean ignorance. Thomas delivered the information plainly. Samuel hanged by Klansmen, church burned, no justice coming from official channels. He asked if Isaiah wanted to attend the burial. Isaiah stood in the cabin doorway for nearly a minute without speaking, his face showing nothing, his hands loose at his sides. Finally he said, "Tell Ruth I'll pay for the stone." Then he closed the door. Thomas rode back to town with the distinct impression that he'd just witnessed something shift inside a man who'd been holding very still for a very long time. What Thomas didn't see was Isaiah walking through his cabin after the door closed, touching objects he'd positioned with meticulous care over 6 years. A rifle on pegs above the fireplace, rope coiled beneath the bed, jars of rendered fat stored in the root cellar, sections of floor that lifted on hidden hinges. Every item in that 20-foot square had a purpose, and every purpose connected to a single question Isaiah had been asking himself since 1866. How do you kill a large number of men who believe they can't be touched? The records are sparse on Isaiah Cole's service during the war, but what exists suggests a man shaped by unusual circumstances. He enlisted in the 14th United States Colored Troops in February of 1864, age 19, listing his occupation as farm laborer and his birthplace as Davidson County, Tennessee. The 14th fought in several engagements around Petersburg, suffering heavy casualties during the crater explosion in July. Isaiah's name appears on rosters through August, then vanishes from company records until December, when he resurfaces as part of a special detachment assigned to intelligence gathering behind Confederate lines. The detachment consisted of 12 men, all black, all volunteers, commanded by a white lieutenant named Eugene Marsh, who'd requested soldiers with specific skills: tracking, orienteering, carpentry, and the ability to move silently through hostile territory. They operated in small groups of 2 or 3, slipping through Confederate positions to gather information on troop movements, supply lines, and fortifications. Unlike traditional scouts, they were authorized to eliminate sentries and pickets when necessary to protect their cover. The work required patience, nerve, and a willingness to kill efficiently without witnesses. Isaiah proved exceptionally good at it. Lieutenant Marsh's surviving correspondence includes a letter dated March 18, 1865, in which he notes, "Private Cole possesses an unusual facility for anticipating enemy patterns and exploiting terrain to create advantages where none appear to exist. He has personally neutralized 17 confirmed targets without alert being raised." The letter goes on to request Cole's transfer to permanent intelligence work, but the war ended before any reassignment occurred. Those 17 confirmed targets were Confederate soldiers killed in ways designed to look like accidents, illness, or desertion. Isaiah learned to read landscapes like text, identifying places where a man might fall and break his neck, where a stream could hide a body, where a sentry could vanish and no one would search until morning. He learned to wait for hours in cramped spaces, to move without sound, to kill with hands or improvised weapons when firearms would attract attention. Most importantly, he learned that small numbers could defeat large ones if the small numbers controlled the environment, and understood that patience was a weapon. When the war ended, Isaiah was 20 years old with skills that had no peacetime application. He returned to Tennessee carrying knowledge that separated him from other veterans. He understood exactly how fragile the human body was, how easily a man could be made to disappear, and how chaos could be engineered through careful preparation. He'd spent 14 months learning to be invisible and lethal. The Klan would eventually learn what that education had cost to acquire. But first, Isaiah needed them to come to him. Everything he'd built over 6 years, the isolated cabin, the withdrawn reputation, the cultivated image of cowardice, was designed to create a single set of circumstances where the Klan would commit overwhelming force in a location Isaiah controlled completely. Samuel's death gave him the final ingredient, motivation the Klan would believe and could use against him. The trap was set. Now he needed bait. Marcus Webb ran a general store on the north edge of Pulaski, a weathered building that sold dry goods, hardware, and information in roughly equal measure. He was 43 years old, prosperous enough to own his building free and clear, and connected enough to know which white men wore hoods on Saturday nights. He also owed money. $600 borrowed from a Nashville bank to expand his inventory, due in full by the end of October, 1872. The debt was legal, documented, and increasingly unlikely to be repaid, given that half his customers bought on credit they couldn't honor. Isaiah walked into Webb's store on September 15th carrying $200 in Union script and a proposal that required neither man to speak the arrangement aloud. The money came in 4 installments of $50 each, paid monthly, with the understanding that Webb would mention certain details to certain customers who visited his store after dark. The details Isaiah needed spread were specific: that the reclusive farmer in the hills had come to town 3 times in the past month, always purchasing unusual quantities of lamp oil and canvas, that he'd been seen near the old Union garrison outside town, the one abandoned since the war ended. That someone, Webb couldn't say who, had claimed to see papers in Isaiah's wagon, official-looking documents with names and ranks printed in columns. Webb understood what he was being asked to do. The Klan drew membership from farmers, merchants, and small landowners who saw Reconstruction as theft and violence as restoration. They met in his store because the back room had a separate entrance, and Webb could be trusted to notice nothing. If Webb mentioned Isaiah Cole in the right way to the right people, rumors would spread efficiently through networks already primed to see conspiracy everywhere. The question was whether $200 was worth potentially directing the Klan toward a man who'd done Webb no harm. Webb took the money. He later told himself it was because the debt was real and the bank wouldn't extend again. But the truth lived somewhere darker. Webb was tired of being afraid, tired of walking carefully, tired of watching violence happen and pretending blindness was virtue. If the Klan wanted to destroy a black farmer who kept to himself, they'd do it with or without Webb's help. At least this way Webb survived financially. It was a small rationalization, the kind that lets complicity wear a practical face. The rumors started circulating within a week. Klansmen who bought nails or rope from Webb's store heard about the strange activity at Isaiah Cole's cabin, the furtive trips to town, the possible connection to Union authorities who supposedly maintained lists of Klan members for eventual prosecution. The information matched anxieties already present. Federal troops had pulled out of Tennessee in 1869, but periodic investigations still occurred when violence drew Washington's attention. The idea that someone might be documenting Klan activities for Northern newspapers or congressional committees touched a nerve. By late September, the Grand Cyclops of the Pulaski Klan, a man named Josiah Farrell who owned a tobacco warehouse and 200 acres, had heard enough secondhand reports that he called a meeting. Farrell was intelligent enough to be skeptical of convenient stories and experienced enough to know that black farmers rarely provoked the Klan without reason. He sent 3 men to scout Isaiah's cabin, observe his movements, and determine whether the rumors held substance. The scouts returned with information that seemed to confirm everything. Isaiah's cabin showed recent improvements: new boards on the roof, fresh chinking between logs. A root cellar had been dug, deeper, large enough to hide substantial goods. The chimney had been modified, its opening widened. Most damning, Isaiah himself had been seen walking the perimeter of his property with deliberate purpose, as though checking measurements or positions. The scouts saw what they expected to see, which was exactly what Isaiah had prepared them to find. The question of complicity extended beyond Marcus Webb's general store. It lived in the careful silence of Giles County's churches, courthouses, and parlors, in the space between what people knew and what they pretended not to understand. By October of 1872, enough violence had occurred that patterns were impossible to miss. Freedmen's property burned, black families driven from land they'd purchased legally, men disappearing after testifying about night riders. Yet congregations prayed for peace in abstract terms. Judges found insufficient evidence despite witnesses, and newspapers reported incidents as isolated tragedies with no connecting thread. Reverend Charles Hutchins led the First Methodist Church in Pulaski, a congregation that included several prominent Klan members, though Hutchins himself claimed no affiliation. He'd preached 4 sermons since Samuel Cole's lynching, each addressing Christian duty and mercy, none mentioning the burned church or the man hanged in plain sight. When asked directly by a church elder whether he planned to condemn the violence, Hutchins responded that politics had no place in spiritual matters and that healing required forgiveness, not accusation. What would you do if you were Reverend Hutchins? Would you risk your position, your congregation's financial support, and possibly your safety to name evil plainly? Or would you tell yourself that quiet ministry to individual souls mattered more than public stands that might empty pews and end your ability to serve anyone? The arithmetic of cowardice rarely announces itself honestly. It dresses in pragmatism and whispers that surviving to fight another day is wisdom, even when another day never comes. Sheriff Deckard faced similar calculations. He'd investigated 3 lynchings, 2 church burnings, and dozens of assaults since taking office in 1870. He'd filed reports, interviewed witnesses, and sent findings to the district attorney in Columbia, who declined to prosecute for lack of evidence. Deckard knew many of the perpetrators by name. He drank with them, bought feed from their stores, attended barbecues at their farms. Arresting them would require a warrant, a judge willing to sign it, a prosecutor willing to try the case, and a jury willing to convict. The chain had too many links controlled by men who wore hoods on Saturday and suits on Sunday. So Deckard did what seemed possible. He documented everything meticulously, hoping that some future authority with greater power might find his records useful. He told himself he was building a case that would eventually deliver justice. Didn't acknowledge, perhaps even to himself, that meticulous documentation of ongoing atrocities while doing nothing to stop them made him a kind of historian of evil, recording crimes for an audience that might never arrive. The Black community in Giles County understood these dynamics with crystalline clarity. They organized mutual aid societies, purchased weapons despite laws restricting access, and maintained networks of information that moved faster than any telegraph. But they also knew that open resistance invited massacre. The Colfax massacre in Louisiana had occurred the previous spring. More than 100 Black men killed by white militias while trying to defend a courthouse. Federal troops arrived too late. Prosecution failed, and the message was clear. Fighting back openly meant dying publicly. Isaiah Cole's approach represented a different strategy, one that worked within white expectations while subverting them completely. By appearing weak, isolated, and focused on personal survival, he'd become dismissible in the eyes of those who might otherwise have watched him carefully. The Klan saw a coward with something to steal. Isaiah saw 1,000 men about to walk into a kill zone they'd never recognize until escape was impossible. The story of Union gold buried near Pulaski had circulated since the war's end, one of those persistent legends that refused to die despite complete absence of evidence. According to various tellings, a Union supply train had been ambushed outside town in the spring of 1865, carrying payroll meant for troops in Nashville. The gold supposedly disappeared during the chaos, hidden by soldiers who died before revealing its location. Variations included Confederate raiders, double crosses, and maps torn into pieces that no one could fully reassemble. Isaiah understood that people wanted the story to be true. 6 years of Reconstruction had been economically brutal for former Confederates. Land values had collapsed, currency was unstable, and labor arrangements had shifted in ways that offended both profit margins and racial hierarchies. The fantasy of hidden gold represented a shortcut back to prosperity, a way to reclaim power without acknowledging that the old system was gone. Isaiah simply gave the fantasy a new location. Marcus Webb's carefully spread rumors evolved through October. The story now claimed that Isaiah Cole had documents indicating his cabin sat directly above where Union soldiers buried strongboxes before evacuating. The papers supposedly included a map, correspondence between officers, and a list of coordinates that Isaiah had been slowly excavating over 6 years. The reason for his isolation made sense in this telling. He didn't want witnesses who might claim a share. The widened chimney, deepened cellar, and nighttime digging all supported the narrative. The genius of the lie was its flexibility. When skeptical Klansmen questioned why a black farmer would have access to Union documents, the answer was obvious. He'd served in the 14th USCT and maintained connections to Northern authorities. When they asked why he hadn't dug up the gold already, the response was patient. He'd been waiting for the right moment when federal troops might protect his claim. The delayed timeline explained everything, and delay suited Isaiah's purposes perfectly. The longer the Klan planned, the more momentum would build, the more men would commit. By mid-October, Josiah Farrell had convened 3 meetings of the Klan's leadership to discuss options. The original plan, burning Isaiah's cabin and hanging him as punishment for unnamed offenses, had evolved into something more complex. If the gold existed, taking it required careful execution. Simply killing Isaiah might mean losing the exact location or triggering federal investigation. Better to capture him alive, force him to reveal the gold's location, than eliminate him and any witnesses. The logistics demanded more men than a typical raid, especially if they expected resistance or wanted to intimidate other freedmen into silence. Farrell proposed a massive show of force. Every Klan member in Giles County, plus recruits from neighboring counties, assembled in a ring around Isaiah's cabin. The numbers would terrify anyone inside, prevent escape, and demonstrate the Klan's power so overwhelming that future resistance would seem futile. Nearly 1,000 men moving in coordinated action would also send a message to Republican authorities. Tennessee belonged to white Southerners, and any attempt to enforce equality would be met with violence too large to prosecute. The date was set for October 14th, chosen because a waning moon would provide enough light to move, but not enough to expose individual faces. Each man would bring a horse, torch, and weapon. Leaders from Lincoln and Marshall counties would join, swelling the numbers further. The plan called for the ring to tighten at midnight, giving Isaiah nowhere to run. They'd smoke him out if necessary, or burn the cabin if he refused to surrender. The gold would be divided among leadership, with shares distributed by rank. What none of them considered was that the gold's absence was precisely the point. Isaiah needed the Klan committed to a single location at a specific time, focused on an objective that required close approach and sustained presence. He needed them convinced their victory was inevitable, their numbers overwhelming, their cause both profitable and righteous. Every element of the story had been designed to produce exactly what Isaiah required. 1,000 men standing exactly where he wanted them, doing exactly what he'd planned for 6 years. The fortune they sought existed only in the imagination Marcus Webb had carefully seeded. But the trap they were walking into was utterly real. Isaiah had purchased his 40 acres because of its topography, not its farming potential. The land sat in a narrow valley with steep ridges on 3 sides and a single access point from the east. The cabin occupied the valley's western end, positioned so that anyone approaching had to cross open ground for the final 200 yards. Natural drainage had carved a creek through the valley's center, running south to north in a shallow ravine that most people wouldn't notice in daylight and certainly couldn't see in darkness. The work began in 1867, slow enough to avoid suspicion, systematic enough to complete before time ran out. Isaiah dug the trenches first, following the creek's natural path, but extending them in a grid pattern that covered the valley floor. The trenches measured 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, narrow enough that a man could step across them easily, but wide enough to snap a horse's leg if the animal stepped wrong. He covered them with thin boards, then soil and dead grass so they'd blend into the surrounding terrain. The entire grid took 14 months to complete, working at night when no one could observe. The chimney modification came next. Isaiah rebuilt the cabin's chimney in 1869, ostensibly because the original had cracked during a harsh winter. The new design incorporated a false flue that could be blocked at the base, forcing smoke back into the cabin temporarily. More importantly, it included a cavity packed with black powder stolen from a mining operation in Franklin County. The powder was stable when left alone, volatile when exposed to sustained heat or direct flame. If someone tried to smoke Isaiah out by blocking the chimney's top, the heat buildup would eventually reach the powder and convert the chimney into a vertical bomb. The cabin itself was a shell. Isaiah had constructed false walls inside the original structure, creating gaps of 6 inches on all 4 sides. The gaps were filled with dirt, making the walls resistant to gunfire, but also much thicker than they appeared from outside. The floor included 3 sections that lifted on leather hinges, revealing tunnels that led to the root cellar and beyond. The cellar extended 30 feet in 3 directions, connecting to hidden exits that emerged inside thick brush on the valley's slopes. A man could enter the cabin and vanish underground before pursuers breached the door. Oil was the most dangerous component. Isaiah had been purchasing lamp oil in small quantities since 1868, storing it in sealed jars buried throughout the valley. By October of 1872, he had nearly 200 gallons distributed in caches that followed the trench system. Each cache included a wick that could be lit remotely using runners of cloth soaked in oil, creating delayed fuses. The oil could be poured into the trenches to create barriers of flame, splashed on the ground to discourage pursuit, or thrown as bombs if containers were sealed and heated. Every cache was positioned to control movement through the valley. Isaiah studied the military theory he'd learned during the war, particularly the principles of defense in depth and killing zones. The valley's geography naturally funneled attackers toward the cabin, concentrating them in space where Isaiah's preparations were densest. By forcing the clan to approach from the east, he could predict their formation, anticipate their movements, and trigger responses at moments of maximum disruption. The goal wasn't to fight 1,000 men head-on. It was to convert their numbers into a liability that generated panic and paralysis. He tested components throughout the years. In 1869, he staged a controlled burn that consumed 40 yards of oil-soaked trench to verify ignition timing. In 1870, he exploded a chimney mock-up to confirm the powder charge's direction and force. In 1871, he spent 3 months practicing movement through the underground tunnels while disoriented, learning to navigate in complete darkness using touch and memory. Every system was refined through iteration until failure points were eliminated and redundancies were built in. The work required absolute isolation. Samuel had occasionally asked about his brother's projects, but Isaiah had deflected with vague references to farming improvements and storm preparation. After Samuel moved to the settlement, Isaiah accelerated construction, knowing he was running against an uncertain deadline. The clan's violence was escalating. Sooner or later, something would focus their attention on Isaiah's cabin. The burning of Ezekiel Chapel and Samuel's lynching simply provided the spark earlier than Isaiah had anticipated. By September of 1872, The valley was a single integrated weapon system disguised as an isolated farm. Every component waited in dormancy, requiring only Isaiah's presence and the clan's commitment to activate. The 1,000 men Josiah Farrell was assembling represented exactly the force Isaiah had designed the valley to destroy. October 13, 1872, brought cold rain that turned roads into mud and made torches difficult to light. Isaiah spent the day inside his cabin, reviewing mental maps of the valley and verifying that supplies were positioned correctly. He ate a meal of cornbread and preserved meat, then cleaned his rifle despite knowing he'd likely never fire it. The weapon was theater, a prop the clan would expect. Isaiah's real arsenal consisted of matches, patience, and 6 years of preparation. He thought about Samuel more than he'd allowed himself to since Thomas Garrett's visit. The grief lived in a compartment Isaiah had sealed off, understanding that opening it would compromise the focus necessary for what came next. But on this final evening, he permitted himself to remember his brother as a child, the way Samuel had insisted on following Isaiah everywhere, the questions he'd asked about everything, the absolute confidence that his older brother could protect him from any danger. That confidence had been misplaced. Isaiah had learned to kill during the war, but that skill hadn't prevented Samuel's death. The question of revenge required examination. Isaiah had built this trap before Samuel died, motivated by a more abstract understanding of what the clan represented and what would eventually be required to stop them. Samuel's lynching had simply provided the catalyst, the moment when future action became present necessity. What Isaiah planned for the following night wasn't personal vengeance. It was strategic elimination of men who demonstrated they couldn't coexist with black freedom. The distinction mattered, though Isaiah acknowledged it was thin enough that grief probably sharpened his resolve. 3 miles away, Josiah Farrell met with his lieutenants in the back room of Marcus Webb's store, finalizing assignments for the following night. The rain complicated logistics, but wouldn't postpone the action. Too many men had already committed, and word had spread through counties beyond Giles. Backing down now would make the clan look weak, and weakness invited the kind of federal scrutiny everyone wanted to avoid. The plan was simple enough that weather shouldn't matter. Assemble in the staging area east of Cole's property by 11 o'clock. Move into position by midnight. Tighten the ring until Cole surrendered or was smoked out. Farrell had recruited 217 men from Giles County alone, with another 300 arriving from Lincoln and Marshall counties. Neighboring Claverns in Lawrence and Maury counties had sent smaller delegations, bringing the total to somewhere near 900, possibly crossing 1,000 depending on final counts. Each man had been instructed to bring a white hood, a torch, and either a pistol or rifle. The horses would form the outer ring while men on foot moved closer to the cabin. Farrell himself would lead the delegation that accepted Cole's surrender and secured the gold. The question of what happened after they found the gold had been discussed privately. Farrell understood that allowing Isaiah Cole to live meant risking federal investigation and potential prosecution. The safer path was elimination, but that required ensuring no witnesses remained who might testify. The freedmen community would know what happened, but without specific evidence or living participants, authorities couldn't build a case. Fire was the cleanest solution. If Cole died in the burning cabin while resisting arrest, the story wrote itself. Marcus Webb listened to the planning from behind his store counter, stocking shelves with hands that shook slightly. He'd started this chain of events with rumors spread for money, and now nearly 1,000 men were preparing to attack a single cabin in the hills. The scope felt disconnected from Webb's original participation, as though he'd lit a candle that had somehow become a wildfire. He told himself he'd had no choice, that the debt was real, that Isaiah Cole had used Webb's financial desperation to engineer this outcome. It was easier than admitting he'd simply chosen the path that cost him nothing until it was too late to choose differently. Reverend Hutchins prayed that evening for peace and wisdom, asking divine guidance without specifying what situation required intervention. He'd heard rumors about the planned raid, information that circulated through his congregation despite official secrecy. He could have spoken to Sheriff Deckard, could have sent word to federal authorities in Nashville, could have preached a sermon making clear that mass violence contradicted every Christian principle. Instead, he prayed in abstractions and told himself that ministers who involved themselves in political matters lost the ability to minister at all. Sheriff Deckard wrote a detailed report on the evening of October 13th, documenting everything he'd learned about the planned Klan action. He noted the expected numbers, the stated objective, the clear intent to commit violence regardless of whether Isaiah Cole surrendered peacefully. Deckard sealed the report in an envelope addressed to the U.S. Marshal in Nashville and placed it in his desk drawer, planning to mail it after the raid concluded. If something went catastrophically wrong, the report would establish that he'd known about the action and documented it, even if he'd done nothing to prevent it. The logic was circular enough that Deckard didn't examine it too closely. Isaiah Cole blew out his cabin's lamps at 9 o'clock, then waited in darkness. He didn't sleep. The mental rehearsal consumed hours, which fuses to light first, which trenches to ignite in sequence, where to position himself when the panic started. He'd planned for contingencies, built redundancies, but chaos was inherently unpredictable. 1,000 variables could shift outcomes. Isaiah simply trusted that the Klan's assumptions would override their caution, that greed and racism would make them careless, and that careless men died easily when the ground itself became hostile. The rain stopped near midnight. The moon emerged briefly through thinning clouds, then vanished again. October 14th had arrived. The Klansmen began assembling at the staging area 3 miles east of Isaiah's cabin just before 11 o'clock on the night of October 14th. They arrived in groups of 10 or 20, riding through mud that muffled hoofbeats, their torches extinguished until the final approach. Josiah Farrell had designated the staging area carefully, a clearing large enough to hold hundreds of men and horses, but far enough from the cabin that Isaiah wouldn't hear the gathering. The logistics of organizing nearly 1,000 men took longer than anticipated. Riders from distant counties arrived late, confused about the exact location. Arguments broke out about positioning and command structure. By 11:45, Farrell abandoned attempts at perfect coordination and gave the order to advance. The formation was rough but functional. Mounted men on the perimeter forming 3 concentric rings, with the outermost positioned approximately 500 yards from the cabin. Men on foot filled the gaps, carrying unlit torches and weapons. The plan called for a slow constriction, tightening the rings until escape was impossible, then lighting torches simultaneously to create a wall of flame and intimidation. The signal to light would be a rifle shot from Farrell himself. Isaiah heard them coming when the first horses entered the valley's eastern mouth. The sound wasn't dramatic. Leather creaking, metal jangling, occasional curses as men navigated unfamiliar terrain in darkness. He'd positioned himself in the root cellar by that point, crouched beside the tunnel entrance with a line of oil-soaked cloth in his right hand and matches in his left pocket. 3 oil lamps burned at strategic points in the cellar, providing enough light to work by, but positioned where their glow wouldn't reach the surface. The cabin above was empty, its door barred from inside, its windows shuttered. The outermost ring of horses took position without incident. The riders couldn't see the trenches in the darkness, and the horses walked carefully enough on unfamiliar ground that they didn't step into the hidden grid. Not yet. The second ring advanced, closing to 300 yards, then stopped to maintain formation. Farrell rode among them, checking positions, urging patience. The psychological effect of overwhelming numbers depended on coordination. If they rushed forward chaotically, the display lost its power. The third ring, consisting of men on foot, began moving toward the cabin at midnight exactly. They advanced slowly, maintaining rough lines, torches ready but unlit. The darkness was nearly absolute under heavy cloud cover, forcing them to navigate by feel and occasional whispered directions. 200 men crossed the valley's open ground, heading toward a cabin that showed no light, no movement, no sign anyone was home. Some of them began wondering if Isaiah had fled, if all this coordination had been wasted on an empty structure. That's when Isaiah lit the first fuse. The oil-soaked cloth ignited with a soft whoosh, then began burning along its length toward a cache buried 40 yards north of the cabin. Isaiah had calculated the burn time at approximately 90 seconds, enough delay that he could light 3 more fuses before the first explosion. He worked quickly, striking matches with practiced efficiency, touching flame to cloth, then retreating deeper into the tunnel system. Behind him, 4 runners of fire snaked through the darkness like glowing veins, invisible from above until they reached their destinations. The first cache detonated at 12:02 in the morning, erupting in a column of flame that threw burning oil 30 feet into the air. The blast wasn't loud. No gunpowder, just heated oil exploding, outward. But the sudden light was blinding after complete darkness. Men on foot froze, momentarily unsure what had happened. Then the second cache detonated. Then the third, then the fourth, creating a rough square of flame around the advancing Klansmen. The psychological effect was immediate. Trapped between fire and an enemy they couldn't see, the men on foot broke formation and ran. Some ran toward the cabin, seeking escape from the flames. Others retreated toward the horses, colliding with mounted men trying to understand what was happening. The confusion intensified when the first horses stepped into the trenches. The animals' legs snapped with sounds audible across the valley, their screams mixing with men's shouts. Riders were thrown, some landing in the trenches themselves, others crashing onto ground that had become a maze of hidden pits. The second ring of horses tried to retreat, but found their path blocked by the third ring, creating a compression that turned orderly formation into thrashing chaos. Isaiah emerged from a concealed exit 70 yards north of the cabin, positioned behind the clan's lines. He carried no weapon, needing his hands free for what came next. The trenches he dug included several main arteries pre-filled with oil but not yet ignited. He moved to the first ignition point, struck a match, and dropped it into the trench. The flame raced along the channel in both directions, creating a wall of fire 10 feet high that divided the clan's forces and illuminated the valley in harsh orange light. The illumination revealed the trap's full scope. Everywhere the Klansmen looked, the ground betrayed them. Trenches appeared where solid earth should have been. Horses stumbled into pits hidden by thin boards that collapsed under weight. The cabin itself sat at the center of a grid designed to funnel movement into kill zones where fire and terrain combined to make escape nearly impossible. The 1,000 men Josiah Farrell had assembled weren't fighting an enemy. They were being processed by a system that had anticipated their every move. Josiah Farrell understood within the first 5 minutes that the raid had become a catastrophe. The gold had been a fiction, the coward a fiction, the entire premise a lure that had worked exactly as intended. Farrell's strategic mind, the same intellect that had organized Klansmen across 3 counties, recognized that continuing the attack would only compound losses. The correct decision was immediate retreat, accepting casualties already taken and preventing further damage. But 1,000 men don't retreat in darkness through unfamiliar terrain while fire spreads and horses scream. Farrell needed to restore order before giving any command. He rode toward the center of the formation, shouting for his lieutenants, trying to identify men who could organize sections and create controlled withdrawal. 3 of his lieutenants were already dead, their horses having collapsed into trenches that broke legs and necks simultaneously. A 4th lieutenant, Carter Price from Lincoln County, sat on the ground holding his arm at an angle that suggested fracture. Price looked up at Farrell with an expression that mixed pain and fury. "There's no gold," Price said unnecessarily. "It was always a trap." "I know," Farrell replied. "We need to pull everyone back to the staging area. Can you ride?" Price tried to stand, fell, tried again. "Give me a horse." But the horses were the primary casualty. Of the roughly 600 animals that had entered the valley, perhaps 200 remained capable of carrying riders. The rest had fallen, broken themselves, or fled in panic. The ratio meant that most Klansmen would have to retreat on foot through terrain they couldn't navigate, pursued by fires they couldn't predict. The mathematics were brutal. The clan's advantage in numbers had become a liability in confinement. Isaiah had moved to a second position on the valley's southern ridge, watching the chaos with the detachment he'd learned during the war. He counted 13 fires burning, 5 more than he'd intended, suggesting some of the oil caches had ignited sympathetically when flames spread along the trench network. The fires created light enough to see the clan's disorganization clearly. Small groups of men huddled in spaces between the trenches, uncertain whether advancing or retreating would put them in worse danger. Others ran blindly, some toward the cabin, some toward the valley's entrance, their panic overriding any tactical sense. From this position, Isaiah could see the clan's leadership trying to establish control. Farrell was the obvious target, riding a large bay horse that stood out even in the chaos. 2 other men on horseback flanked him, probably senior lieutenants. Isaiah had prepared for this possibility. He'd buried sections of oil-soaked brush along the southern ridge, positioned where they could be rolled downhill toward specific targets. The brush bundles weighed approximately 40 pounds each, heavy enough to maintain momentum, light enough to ignite easily. He lit the first bundle and let it roll. The burning brush crashed through smaller vegetation, gathering speed, heading directly toward Farrell's position. The timing was difficult to calculate, downhill momentum versus irregular terrain, but Isaiah had practiced with unlit bundles until he could predict trajectory reliably. This one struck the ground 3 feet to Farrell's right, exploding in sparks that spooked his horse. The animal reared, throwing Farrell backward. He hit the ground hard, his left leg pinned beneath the horse as it scrambled upright and bolted. The fall likely saved Farrell's life. Isaiah had been reaching for the rifle he'd kept hidden on the ridge, intending to shoot if the burning brush failed. But a wounded man on the ground was less important than the 2 lieutenants still mounted and trying to restore order. Isaiah shifted his aim to the closer lieutenant, a man whose white hood had fallen away, revealing a face Isaiah didn't recognize. The shot was perhaps 80 yards downhill, with inconsistent light. Isaiah squeezed the trigger and saw the man topple from his horse. Whether the bullet struck true or the man simply fell didn't matter. The effect was the same. The second lieutenant wheeled his horse and rode hard for the valley entrance, abandoning any pretense of leadership. Isaiah let him go. The goal wasn't killing every Klansman. It was destroying their organizational structure and creating memories terrifying enough to prevent future large-scale actions. One man fleeing in panic served that purpose as effectively as one man dead. But Farrell represented a different calculation. As Grand Cyclops, he was the linchpin holding multiple Klaverns together. His death would fracture the clan's coordination across 3 counties, potentially preventing similar raids for years. Isaiah descended the southern ridge using a path he'd memorized, moving quickly through brush that would have been impenetrable to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. He reached the valley floor 60 yards from where Farrell lay, struggling with his pinned leg. The distance closed to 40 yards. 30. Isaiah moved through patches of shadow between fires, using the flame's unpredictable light to remain unseen. At 20 yards, he could hear Farrell cursing, trying to lever his leg free. 2 other Klansmen approached to help, and Isaiah froze. The calculation shifted. 3 men together were more dangerous than 1 wounded leader. Isaiah waited, controlling his breathing, the rifle ready but not raised. The 2 Klansmen reached Farrell, grabbed his arms and pulled him free. His leg was broken, that much was obvious from how it bent, but he could be carried. Isaiah let them carry him 15 feet, then stepped into the firelight with his rifle raised. "Stop!" All 3 men froze. The 2 helping Farrell were young, probably under 25, their hoods pushed back, revealing faces slick with sweat and soot. They looked at Isaiah with expressions that mixed fear and confusion, as though they couldn't reconcile the threat before them with everything they'd been told about the cabin's occupant. "Put him down," Isaiah said quietly. They lowered Farrell to the ground. His face was pale with pain, his breath coming in short gasps, but his eyes remained focused on Isaiah with something like recognition. "You're Cole." "I am. There's no gold. There never was." Farrell closed his eyes briefly, processing what that meant. The months of planning, the coordination, the commitments made across multiple counties, all based on a fiction so complete that no one had questioned it. When he opened his eyes, something had shifted. "You did this to kill us." "No," Isaiah replied. "I did this to make you understand what it feels like to be hunted by numbers too large to fight. Now you know." The 2 young Klansmen stood, motionless, waiting to see if Isaiah would shoot. He studied them with the same cold assessment he'd applied to Confederate sentries during the war. Evaluate threat level, determine if elimination is necessary, act without hesitation if the answer is yes. But these 2 showed no signs of resistance. Their weapons had been dropped or lost during the chaos. They were terrified, trapped, and waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Isaiah made a decision that would define how the night's events were remembered. "Walk to the valley entrance. Don't run. Don't look back. If I see you again tonight, I'll assume you're armed." They hesitated, glancing at Farrell, uncertain whether abandoning their leader constituted another kind of betrayal. Farrell made the decision for them. "Go. Tell the others to pull back. No one else needs to die here." The 2 young men walked away slowly, their backs rigid with the expectation of bullets that didn't come. Isaiah watched until they disappeared into darkness beyond the firelight, then returned his attention to Farrell. The Grand Cyclops lay on his back, his broken leg extended at an awkward angle, his face gray with shock. In different circumstances, he would have required immediate medical attention. In current circumstances, he'd likely bleed internally and die within hours. "You could have shot me from the ridge," Farrell said. His voice had weakened, each word requiring effort. "Why didn't you?" "Because I want you to carry a message." Isaiah crouched just outside arm's reach, the rifle still ready but lowered slightly. "Your organization put a noose around my brother's neck and watched him die. You burned a church where families prayed. You've terrorized people trying to build lives from nothing." Tonight was the response. If the Klan comes back to Giles County, if you burn another church or hang another man, I'll make this night look like mercy. Do you understand? Farrell stared at him with an expression Isaiah couldn't quite read. Pain, certainly, but also something else. Calculation, maybe, or the cold comprehension that comes from recognizing an opponent's capability. "You think killing a few dozen men will stop what's coming? The Klan is larger than Giles County. We're organized across the entire South. You've made yourself a target for thousands." "Then thousands can come," Isaiah replied. "I've got 40 acres and 6 years of preparation. How many of those thousands want to die testing whether I've got more surprises waiting?" It was a bluff, partially. Isaiah had prepared the valley exhaustively, but replicating this level of defense required time and resources he wouldn't have again. If the Klan returned with proper reconnaissance and caution, they could overwhelm any fixed position through patience and superior numbers. But Isaiah was gambling that tonight's casualties would create a mythology larger than the tactical reality. That survivors would tell stories about the cabin that moved and the man who vanished. That fear would accomplish what continued resistance couldn't. Farrell understood the gamble. "You're betting we're too afraid to try again. I'm betting your people will remember tonight every time someone suggests attacking a cabin in the hills. I'm betting the cost of revenge seems higher after watching friends burn. I'm betting you'd rather find easier targets than risk another night like this." Isaiah stood. "That's not cowardice, Farrell. That's mathematics. You people love mathematics when it favors your side. Now you're on the wrong end of the calculation." Behind them, the fires were beginning to die down. The oil was finite. The wood wouldn't burn indefinitely, and without active stoking, the flames would collapse into embers within the hour. The Klan's withdrawal had become more organized, with surviving leaders gathering men near the valley entrance and attempting rough headcounts. Shouts carried across the open ground, names called, injuries reported, the slow accounting of disaster. Isaiah picked up Farrell's fallen hood from where it had landed in the mud. The white cloth was stained with soot and blood, its eye holes ragged from rough stitching. He held it up so Farrell could see. "You wear this because anonymity means no consequences. But I know your name. I know where you live. I know you've got a tobacco warehouse on the North Road and a family farm east of town. If my brother's killer isn't found and delivered to federal authorities within 1 month, I'll visit your property the same way I visited this valley. Quietly, patiently, and you'll never see me coming." "You're threatening my family?" Farrell's voice carried genuine alarm beneath the pain. "I'm establishing balance," Isaiah corrected. "Your organization threatens families as a matter of practice. Now one family in particular has something to fear. Maybe that makes you reconsider which battles are worth fighting." The ethical complexity of this threat wasn't lost on Isaiah. He'd spent 6 years preparing a defensive position, refusing to initiate violence even as the Klan terrorized freedmen across Giles County. But Samuel's death had shifted something fundamental. The question wasn't whether Isaiah would cross certain lines. The war had established his willingness to kill. But whether the cause justified methods that mirrored the enemy's. Threatening Farrell's family was tactically sound and morally troubling. Isaiah accepted both realities without pretending they weren't in tension. He left Farrell on the ground and moved through the valley, checking each fire, ensuring none would spread beyond intended boundaries. The surrounding forest was wet enough from recent rain that wildfire wasn't a serious risk, but Isaiah had learned that small oversights could compound into catastrophes. He found 3 bodies, 2 Klansmen who died when horses fell on them, and one who'd apparently broken his neck running into a trench. He left them where they lay. The clan could retrieve their dead after sunrise. The cabin still stood, untouched by the chaos around it. Isaiah returned to the root cellar, extinguished the lamps, and sat in darkness listening to the clan's final withdrawal. The sounds took nearly an hour to fade completely. Horses moving carefully through the valley entrance, men helping wounded, someone giving orders in a voice hoarse from shouting. When silence finally returned, Isaiah remained underground until dawn, unwilling to trust that stragglers wouldn't attempt revenge. Sunrise on October 15th revealed the valley's transformation. Trenches that had been invisible in darkness now appeared as obvious scars across the terrain, a grid pattern so extensive that rebuilding the ground would require weeks of labor. Charred patches marked where oil fires had burned. The grass blackened and soil baked hard. 3 horses lay dead, their bodies broken from falls, and one that wasn't dead but couldn't rise, its front legs destroyed. Isaiah shot that one mercifully, the crack of his rifle echoing across the empty valley. He counted 13 bodies in total, though he suspected the actual death toll was higher. Some men had likely died during the retreat, either from injuries sustained in the valley or from panic that caused fatal mistakes on the return journey. Others might have crawled into brush and bled out overnight. Isaiah walked the perimeter systematically, checking each fallen Klansman for signs of life, finding none. The youngest victim appeared to be 16 or 17, his face unmarked by the fall that had broken his back. The ethical weight settled differently in daylight. During the attack, Isaiah had operated with the clinical focus that military service had instilled. Identify threats, execute counters, minimize own exposure. The dead had been abstractions, problems solved, obstacles removed. But standing over bodies in morning light forced a different accounting. These men had terrorized freedmen, yes, and their intentions toward Isaiah had been explicitly murderous. Yet their deaths remained deaths, each representing families that would grieve, communities that would assign blame, and a cycle of violence that Isaiah had just escalated dramatically. He considered the alternatives he'd rejected. Fleeing to another county would have meant abandoning the land he'd purchased legally and leaving other freedmen vulnerable to unopposed clan violence. Appealing to authorities had already proven useless, with Sheriff Deckard documenting atrocities while refusing to prevent them. Organizing collective defense would have resulted in open warfare that Black communities couldn't win against overwhelming white numbers and institutional support. Isaiah's trap had been designed to solve problems that conventional solutions couldn't address, but solutions built on corpses never stayed clean. The question that would haunt him wasn't whether killing these men had been necessary. Isaiah believed it was, but whether necessity purified method. The clan had come for gold that didn't exist, lured by lies Isaiah had carefully constructed. They died in trenches they couldn't see, burned by fires they hadn't anticipated, killed by tactics that gave them no chance to surrender. It was efficient, strategically sound, and uncomfortably close to murder by ambush. Isaiah had learned in the war that killing enemy soldiers in battle was different from killing them while they slept, even when both actions advanced military objectives. The difference mattered, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. He returned to the cabin and began the work of documentation. Using paper and pencil from his sparse supplies, Isaiah drew a detailed map of the valley showing trench locations, fire positions, and where bodies had fallen. He wrote a careful account of the night's events, the clan's approach, the timing of ignitions, the casualties observed. The documentation served two purposes. If federal authorities ever investigated, Isaiah wanted a contemporaneous record that established self-defense. More importantly, the map and account could be used to threaten the clan with exposure. Isaiah had names: Marcus Webb, Josiah Farrell, the lieutenants he'd observed, and could connect them to specific crimes if that leverage became necessary. The task took 3 hours, long enough that several visitors arrived at the valley's entrance and stopped, unwilling to approach further. Isaiah saw them through his cabin window, a white man on horseback observing from safe distance, then 2 black farmers from neighboring properties checking whether Isaiah had survived, then Sheriff Deckard with 2 deputies studying the trenches and bodies from the valley's mouth. None of them entered. Whatever they'd heard about the night's events, the visible aftermath was clear enough. The cabin's occupant had prepared extensively and violently, and approaching uninvited seemed unwise. By noon, Isaiah had finished documentation and burial preparation. The bodies would need to be removed before decomposition attracted animals, but that was the clan's responsibility, not his. He washed in cold water from the creek, changed clothes, and walked to the valley entrance where Sheriff Deckard was still waiting with his deputies. The sheriff's expression mixed relief and apprehension, as though he'd expected to find Isaiah among the dead, but wasn't entirely pleased he hadn't. "Mr. Cole," Deckard said formally, "I need to ask what happened here." Isaiah handed him the written account he'd prepared. "I was attacked by approximately 1,000 Klansmen last night. I defended my property using prepared positions and terrain advantages. 13 bodies remain on my land. I'd appreciate their removal by sunset." Deckard read through the account slowly, his lips moving slightly as he processed details. When he finished, he looked up with an expression Isaiah couldn't quite interpret. "This document claims you knew they were coming. I prepared for the possibility. Given the violence directed at freedmen in this county, preparation seemed prudent. You built trenches across your entire property." "I did." "And you stored oil for use as a weapon." "I stored oil for multiple purposes. One of those purposes was defense." The conversation had a surreal quality, as though they were discussing agricultural techniques rather than mass casualties. But the formality served both men's needs. Deckard required documentation that would satisfy minimal investigative obligations without forcing him to charge Isaiah with any crime. Isaiah needed official recognition that he'd acted defensively, even if that defense had been unusually effective and pre-planned. "I'm going to need you to come to town," Deckard said finally. "Answer questions formally. There may be charges." "What charges?" Isaiah's voice remained level. "I defended my property against trespassers who'd come to kill me. Tennessee law permits lethal force in such circumstances. Tennessee law doesn't permit traps designed to kill indiscriminately. The trenches weren't traps. They were defensive fortifications. The oil was stored legally. The fires were set in response to an active attack. Every action I took occurred while under threat from an organized force that outnumbered me 1,000 to 1. If you want to charge me with defending myself too effectively, I'd be interested to see how that argument holds up." Deckard looked at the valley floor, the bodies, the obvious evidence of systematic preparation. His face showed the calculation Isaiah had seen in many officials, the desire to maintain order conflicting with the knowledge that order had already fractured. Arresting Isaiah would require explaining why a black farmer defending against a Klan lynching party deserved prosecution. Not arresting him meant accepting that someone in Giles County had killed 13 white men without consequence. Neither option was appealing. "Come to town tomorrow," Deckard said finally. "We'll discuss this properly. Bring your documentation." Isaiah nodded. He watched the sheriff and his deputies retreat, then returned to his cabin to complete final preparations. The valley would never be the same. The trenches and burns had converted defensive farmland into visible warning, and Isaiah suspected he'd need to relocate regardless of legal outcomes. But tonight's purpose had been achieved. The Klan had committed maximum force against a target that destroyed them, and survivors would carry stories that made future attacks less appealing. Whether 13 deaths brought lasting safety or simply temporary fear remained uncertain. The Klan's version of events emerged within 48 hours, spread through white communities across Tennessee with the speed that shame and fury produce. According to these accounts, a group of concerned citizens had investigated reports of criminal activity at Isaiah Cole's cabin, intending only to question him about suspicious behavior. Cole had ambushed them with military-grade explosives and coordinated traps, killing men who'd come peacefully. The attack proved that armed black radicals represented a threat to white families throughout the South, justifying the Klan's existence and validating their violence as necessary response. The narrative required ignoring certain facts: that 1,000 men don't gather at midnight for peaceful questioning, that the Klan had been organizing for weeks, that 13 bodies and hundreds of injuries don't result from conversation gone wrong. But narratives built on denial rarely acknowledge their own contradictions. What mattered was establishing a story that converted defeat into justification, that transformed hunters into victims and made Isaiah's survival evidence of danger rather than desperation. The black community's version was more complicated. Isaiah Cole had become simultaneously hero and warning, proof that resistance was possible and that resistance carried costs no individual could bear indefinitely. Families throughout Giles County spoke his name with respect and fear, understanding that one man's victory didn't translate to collective safety. If anything, Isaiah's success might provoke broader retaliation, with the Klan targeting communities rather than individuals to demonstrate their power remained intact. Ruth Cole heard both versions within a week of Samuel's death being avenged. She visited Isaiah on October 19th, riding to the valley entrance with 2 other women from the freedmen's settlement. Isaiah met them at the perimeter, unwilling to allow visitors near the cabin while legal questions remained unresolved. Ruth looked at him with an expression that mixed grief, gratitude, and something that might have been accusation. "They're saying you planned this before Samuel died," Ruth said without preamble. "That you built those trenches years ago." "I did." "So Samuel's death was just timing? An excuse to use what you'd already built?" Isaiah considered lying, but Ruth deserved honesty. "I built defenses anticipating that the Klan would eventually attack. Samuel's lynching made the attack immediate instead of eventual. I'm sorry I couldn't prevent his death. I'm sorry I could only avenge it." Ruth studied him silently, then nodded. "Samuel used to say you were the strongest man he knew. I didn't understand what he meant until now. You're strong enough to live alone with what you've done. I don't know if that's admirable or just sad." She left without further conversation, and Isaiah didn't see her again. The encounter crystallized something he'd been avoiding: that survival wasn't the same as living, that winning didn't eliminate isolation, and that the skills that made him effective at killing made him difficult to exist beside peacefully. Marcus Webb faced his own reckoning. Within days of the attack, multiple Klan survivors had identified his store as the source of rumors about Isaiah's cabin and the supposed gold. Webb initially denied everything, claiming he'd simply repeated gossip he'd overheard. But when Josiah Farrell's widow arrived at his store demanding explanation for why her husband had been lured into a trap based on lies Webb had spread, the denial collapsed. Webb admitted taking money from Isaiah to plant specific stories, justifying it as financial necessity. The white community's response was swift. Webb's store was boycotted, his credit was revoked, and within 2 months, he was bankrupt. He left Giles County in December of 1872, relocating to Kentucky where his complicity wouldn't follow. His departure satisfied no one. The Klan saw him as a traitor who'd enabled black resistance. The black community saw him as a coward who'd sold information for profit without considering consequences. Webb had tried to occupy a neutral position in circumstances that permitted no neutrality, and learned that such positions collapse under minimal pressure. Reverend Hutchins preached a sermon on October 22nd, addressing the violence without naming specifics. He spoke about cycles of retribution, the importance of forgiveness, and the danger of allowing hatred to consume communities. The sermon was eloquent, carefully crafted, and utterly disconnected from the reality of what had occurred. After the service, 3 black families left his congregation permanently. They didn't announce their departure or explain their reasons. They simply stopped attending, understanding that words about forgiveness meant nothing when spoken by someone who'd remained silent during active oppression. Sheriff Deckard wrote another report, this one documenting the Klan's attack on Isaiah's cabin and the subsequent casualties. He noted the evidence of preparation, the defensive nature of Isaiah's actions, and the overwhelming force that had justified lethal response. He concluded that while Isaiah's methods were unusual, they didn't constitute criminal activity under Tennessee law. The report was filed with the district attorney, who declined to prosecute. Deckard had done his job technically, creating a paper trail without actually enforcing law or preventing violence. He would continue as sheriff for another 4 years, documenting atrocities with the same meticulous care that accomplished nothing. Isaiah Cole left Giles County in November of 1872, selling his 40 acres to a white farmer for significantly less than market value. The sale was conducted quietly through Harlan Bosch, the same lawyer who'd handled the original purchase 6 years earlier. Bosch asked no questions about why Isaiah was leaving or where he planned to go. Some information was safer unspoken. The cabin remained standing through the winter, visible from the main road as a reminder of what had occurred there. Children were forbidden from approaching the valley, told that the ground itself was cursed or that Isaiah's ghost walked the trenches at night. Adults knew better, but didn't correct the stories. Better to let myth do the work of memory, keeping people away from a place that represented violence too complicated to explain simply. Federal authorities investigated briefly in December. A U.S. Marshal named Thomas Clayton arrived from Nashville, interviewed Sheriff Deckard, examined the valley, and spoke with several Klan survivors who'd been injured during the attack. Clayton's official report noted that Isaiah Cole had defended his property against an organized assault, that the attackers had come armed and with explicit intent to kill, and that Cole's preparations suggested he'd anticipated violence based on previous Klan activity in the region. The report concluded that no federal laws had been violated and that Tennessee authorities had handled the matter appropriately. What Clayton's report didn't mention was a conversation he'd had with Isaiah before the farmer left Giles County. They'd met on a cold November morning in Bosch's law office, speaking privately for nearly an hour. Clayton had seen military service himself, recognized something in Isaiah's manner that suggested shared experience. He'd asked direct questions about Isaiah's war record, the detachment he'd served in, the skills he'd acquired. Isaiah had answered honestly, understanding that federal protection might depend on Clayton grasping the full context. "You were trained to do this," Clayton had said finally. It wasn't a question. "I was trained to survive behind enemy lines and eliminate targets without creating alert conditions. The Valley was just application of those principles to different circumstances." "And you don't consider what you did murder?" Isaiah had thought carefully before answering. "I consider what I did self-defense that required extensive preparation. If that preparation made it more effective than typical self-defense, I don't see how that changes the fundamental circumstance. They came to kill me. I prevented them." Clayton had nodded slowly, then closed his notebook. "I'm going to recommend no federal prosecution. What you did was legal self-defense, even if it was unusually well-planned. But you need to understand something. The Klan has long memory and deeper resources than one county chapter. They'll be looking for you. Wherever you go, eventually someone will connect your name to what happened here. I know. And you'll spend the rest of your life waiting for that connection? I've spent most of my life waiting for something. This is no different." Isaiah's destination after leaving Tennessee remained unknown for decades. Some accounts placed him in Kansas, working as a hired hand on wheat farms. Others suggested he'd gone further west, perhaps Colorado or California, seeking anonymity in territories where no one knew Tennessee history. A few stories claimed he'd returned to Nashville, living under a different name near his mother until her death in 1879. The truth emerged only in 1923, when a man named Jacob Cole published a brief family history, noting that his grandfather Isaiah had settled in Michigan after the war, working as a carpenter in Detroit until his death in 1898. According to Jacob's account, Isaiah had married in 1875, fathered 3 children, and lived quietly without discussing his past. The family knew he'd served in the Union Army and that something significant had happened in Tennessee. But Isaiah had never provided details. He'd carried whatever weight the Valley created alone, refusing to distribute it to people he loved. The Giles County Klan never recovered its pre-attack strength. The deaths and injuries from October 14th created practical problems. Leadership vacuum, shattered confidence, families who blamed the organization for losses. But more significantly, it established a precedent that terrified them. If one black farmer with sufficient preparation could destroy 1,000 attackers, what would organized black resistance accomplish? The calculation that had always favored white supremacy, superior numbers, institutional support, technological advantage, suddenly seemed less certain. Lynchings and night riding continued in Giles County through the 1870s, but at reduced frequency and with more caution. The Klan became more selective about targets, more careful about intelligence gathering, more aware that some cabins in the hills might harbor surprises that numbers couldn't overwhelm. Isaiah Cole's Valley had introduced doubt into a system that depended on absolute confidence, and doubt was corrosive even when rarely mentioned aloud. The valley itself returned to nature slowly. By 1880, the trenches had collapsed and filled with decades of leaf fall and erosion. The cabin deteriorated until only the stone foundation remained, barely visible beneath vegetation. The land was eventually incorporated into a larger farm, then later subdivided for residential development in the 1960s. Houses now occupy the space where Isaiah planted his trap, their residents unaware that their suburban yards sit atop a grid of trenches that once channeled fire and chaos. No historical marker commemorates what happened there. The event appears in few histories of Reconstruction, mentioned only in academic papers about rural resistance and forgotten outside specialist circles. Isaiah Cole's name is absent from most accounts of the period, overshadowed by more public figures whose resistance took forms easier to celebrate than midnight violence that left 13 men dead. But in certain black families throughout Tennessee, the story persists. Grandparents tell grandchildren about the man who surrounded his cabin with traps so sophisticated that 1,000 attackers died trying to break through. The details shift with each telling. Sometimes the number of Klansmen grows to 5,000. Sometimes the traps include mechanical devices that didn't exist in 1872. Sometimes Isaiah vanishes into mist rather than fleeing to Michigan. What remains constant is the core truth, that one man with sufficient preparation and absolute commitment made himself too costly to attack. Drive through Giles County today, and locals will point out the valley if you ask, though most won't enter it. They'll tell you the ground is unstable, that sinkholes appear without warning, that something about the place feels wrong in ways they can't articulate. Some of that is geology. The trenches Isaiah dug did weaken the soil structure. But some of it is collective memory coded into landscape, the sense that certain places hold violence too deep to fully excavate. And sometimes, on October nights when the moon is waning and clouds make the darkness absolute, people driving past the valley claim to see lights moving in patterns that suggest fire rather than electric lamps. Park rangers insist it's swamp gas or reflected headlights, but the families who remember Isaiah Cole suggest a different explanation, that the valley still burns with something that wasn't entirely extinguished when dawn came on October 15, 1872, and that the man who lit those fires left a piece of himself behind, waiting, patient, and ready to ignite again if the wrong people come looking. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.